Thank you, Claire. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you,
Yes,
Margaret.
That's
Yep,
fine.
perfect.
Thank you. I'm Margaret Coughlan. I'm the chair of the Women's Committee, and alongside me is Geraldine Alexander, who is the chair of the Northern Ireland Committee. So we welcome you to the webinar today on International Women's Day. We are in solidarity with women globally, and especially women that are in conflict. So today we give a special solidarity message to the women and children of Ukraine, and also to the women and girls in Afghanistan. We will now go to our first speaker, who is the General Secretary of Congress of Trade Union, Patricia King.
Thank you, Margaret. I hope you can hear me. Now you can, I think, Margaret, can't you?
Yes, I can indeed.
Okay, good morning or good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for participating in this short webinar to discuss really important, very important issues, particularly for women workers. And if I might just firstly probably divide the issues into two pieces: harassment in the workplace and domestic abuse. Sometimes the two are interlinked, but for purposes of describing in the Republic of Ireland where we have got to in terms of legislation. So we have an Equality Act which was set out and agreed and put into legislation in 1998. And arising out of that, then we have a further code of practice in 2012. And I think it's fairly settled view now that the equality legislation we have in Ireland is progressive and sets out definitions which are very useful and which have stood the test of time in terms of the 9 grounds and harassment on the basis of the 9 grounds and so on. But the code of practice then on a statutory basis goes as far as supplementing what's in the legislation and so on. But notwithstanding what one would say would be a strong enough suite of legislation and legislative pieces on the 9 grounds, 9 equality grounds, and both harassment in the workplace and the definition of sexual harassment, it's probably on a settled legal basis that definition set out is fairly competent in terms of resilience to challenge and so on. But notwithstanding all of that, the Congress survey, which we carried out in 2019, would tell us a lot in terms of the use of that legislation and the value of that legislation to workers. And quite candidly, what that survey told us is that in effect, 1/3 of the respondents who did not report an incident to their employer feared that doing so would have a negative impact on their working relationships. 1/4 of them did not think that they would be believed or taken seriously. And 1 in 4 of them did not believe that the person responsible would be sufficiently punished. Now, they are very, very, I would say, important features in terms of measuring the level of impact that the legislation has, notwithstanding the fact that the key framework of the legislation is generally regarded as good, even by international standards. In terms of harassment in the workplace, when a survey response demonstrates that level, so that one of the big key pieces there is fear. And one of the reasons of the fear or underpinning the fear piece is that the perpetrator can very often be in a supervisory role in relation to the victim. And also there is a power balance piece going on, which is very difficult to address in terms of having the legislation work for you. Now, I think they are, I suppose, real problems that we have to find ways to address by seeking to further augment our pieces of legislation in relation to harassment in the workplace. And that probably takes me on then to look at, over the years, quite a number of big companies did agree to sexual harassment policy in the workplace. And there are quite a number of policies there in workplaces. But there is a whole piece that needs to be done in terms of awareness, in terms of training people and having the employer who has responsibility to ensure that such harassment does not occur in the workplace. So that's quite an onerous responsibility that the employer has. I think we need to revisit, as part of the ILO 190 convention, I think we need to revisit that whole piece of awareness and building confidence among women workers that actually the employer has a responsibility and that there is protection in the law. And that takes me, I suppose, to the ILO convention piece itself, because where we are quite low in terms of our activity and heretofore, and certainly in terms of the development of policy, and certainly in terms of the development of legislative provisions, is in relation to domestic abuse. I want, I think, at this moment to refer to a very good document, which I think everybody should read, which Mandy is on the call, and I know she was involved in the development of it, which is the Danske Bank policy that has been developed in relation to domestic abuse. And I would ask you to have a look at it, and even perhaps this webinar might even resolve to have it as a model agreement that has been made, because it deals with one of the real strong issues around domestic abuse, which is the perpetrator in domestic abuse. And I would ask you at page 15 to go and have a look at that, which for any of us who've had any experience, any knowledge of this piece of domestic abuse, we will know generally where it's men, a lot of these men work in workplaces where they never portray or show, or in fact, they have a very strong sense of pride about their stature and standing in the workplace, when in fact they could be perpetrators of this in their domestic situation. And we know that, I think there's a very useful piece on that Danske Bank policy, whereby they're saying colleagues who commit such acts outside the workplace, but which impact the workplace, will be managed appropriately. This may include disciplinary action and so on. I just want to say that I would like to see us in Congress, advocated by the Women's Committee, I'm sure we could do it in concert with Mandy and colleagues in the FSU, to build a model agreement, a model policy in relation to domestic abuse. Because the ILO convention gives us a lot of clues as to what should be included in any such policy. We should try and achieve leave for victims of domestic violence, flexible working arrangements, protection of victims of domestic violence, temporary protection against dismissal for victims of domestic violence, because again, we all know the fears that can come into, and that's shown in the Congress survey in relation to the harassment. The same will occur and does occur in relation to domestic abuse. People are afraid to say, they're afraid to bring it forward, they're afraid to discuss it. Really, one of the key pieces in the ILO 190 convention is the inclusion of domestic violence in workplace risk assessments. Now, as a person who has participated on quite a number of boards over the years, I can tell you that employers are always very cognizant of what their risk assessment is and what it contains and what are the risk assessment. I have never, ever come across any employer who has looked at or even contemplated domestic abuse being part of the risk assessment. And I do believe that that's a really important feature of the ILO convention. The referral to public mitigation measures for domestic violence where they exist, and the awareness, again, the awareness, perpetrators of violence and harassment in the world of work should be held accountable. And that is so key, because it's the street angel and house devil syndrome, as we know, and that's really important because these abusers do not want to be outed, and they do not want to be seen in their place of work as being participating in this behavior or being seen. So that is going to be a really key piece in terms of trying to lessen the level of abuse. And the person who is abused, who is really stripped of all of their confidence in relation to who they are, because part of this is verbal abuse as well on an ongoing basis, as we know, their whole person can be so diminished by virtue of this. Now, the other piece that I think is really important, and we have not visited this in workplaces, and we should make it part of our policy, is the developing of a service, confidential service, counselling services, and so on, where somebody in the workplace who is the subject of domestic abuse can, through their workplace, access good quality counselling and so on. Because remember, when you're in that situation, you may not even have the opportunity in the domestic situation to actually get that counselling, make that contact, but you could do it through your workplace. Having domestic abuse recognised and accepted by an employer as a fundamental issue that goes on for workers, and supplying and having advice service, confidential services provided would be, in my opinion, a very strong, important feature, positive for workers who are experiencing this. And again, it very well will, I think, mitigate against some of the fears that workers have in terms of, as I said, coming out on the issue of domestic abuse. They don't want to publicly say it, but if they have a confidential advice service which is offered in their workplace, then it can be psychologically and otherwise very helpful that they can do it. Another piece in the ILO convention, which we don't do here in Ireland at all, is labour inspectors and officials of other competent authorities undergoing gender responsive training with a view to identifying and addressing violence and harassment in the world of work. Now, we have, despite the fact that we have strong equality legislation, we have not got a labour inspector who has any officially any form of training in relation to any of these aspects of harassment and domestic violence and recognising it. Over the last number of years, and FACU would be conscious of this, as some other unions say in banking or in hairdressing, there have been moves to train providers of those services to build their awareness so that they can recognise people who may be suffering from and involved in some form of domestic abuse and the victim of such, and that they can report and so on. But we want to go much deeper. We want the workplace to be utilised as a place whereby a worker can take advice, get advice, feel protected, feel that they can access this advice confidentially, and that it's actually, from their point of view, the domestic abuse that they suffer at home, they do bring a huge level of stress to work because it's in their head. How can you, you cannot actually function in some cases, the abuse can be so bad, and yet you have to go to work, you have to experience in a really negative fashion everything that's going on for you. Can you imagine the value of a confidential counselling service where somebody can access and can take advice as to how to handle, even if it's advice in relation to what their legal options are, even if it's advice as to how to handle the psychological impact this is having on them, all of that coming from the workplace, how valuable that would be. Now, that is why I think there is huge value in us having the Convention 190 adopted by the Irish government. It would mean that our legislation would have to reflect the elements of the convention that are not currently reflected in our legislation. As I said, we have good, strong equality legislation, but not necessarily it needs to be to address some of the issues that we have, I suppose, highlighted on the sexual harassment side in terms of the fears that people have. But on the domestic abuse, we have none. and we need to get to a place now. So I think that there is a task for the women's committees across the island to have, we'll have to up our game in terms of advocating that this is included in the suite of measures that both the administrations have in responding to the domestic violence and the harassment in the workplace pieces that we need to address. As I said, the various pieces that we've done in terms of the information gathering and so on, the feedback that has come through in the surveys that we've done are very useful in this. I think we have to really strengthen our approach now to achieve the implementation of the Convention 190. I think the Danske Bank, that has the agreement that has been reached with the FSU is really important and going to be really useful in terms of a lot of the donkey work has been done in terms of production of a model agreement. And when we get that, I think that's going to be really useful. Congress Women's Committees, I hope, will resolve to building the model agreement. Then we go to the employers to have it, to try and have it implemented alongside seeking to advocate, seeking governments to implement the Convention 190 and all that's in it, because I think then and only then will we make a further major impact into the delivery of both protection and I suppose, reduction in the level of domestic violence that we have in our community, which, as we know, is, entertained in places. The perpetrators of this are walking all around our workplaces, 1 in 4 women report that they have suffered abuse of some shape or form domestically, either through violence, through verbal abuse, psychological abuse. So, we all work with people who are doing this. That's the reality of it. So therefore, I think it behoves us all to strengthen our approaches to this. We have a good model in that particular one. We can work with the FSU to see, can Congress produce a model agreement? And then I think we seek to have that implemented in the workplace. Thank you very much, Chair, for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Patricia. I have to say that the committees won't be wanting in working together to build this momentum on policy in relation to women. And, especially in these times when COVID gave us so much data on what was happening when women were locked down in the lockdown. So look, we give you the commitment that we'll work together and certainly try and see if we can get this done within this year. And I hope that we can, because it's very important that we do. So yes, thank you very much, Patricia, and thank you for all your support during the year. Thank you very much for that. And I will now hand over to Geraldine Alexander, who is the chairperson of the Women's Committee in Northern Ireland. Thank you.
Margaret, thank you very much indeed. Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure as joint chair to take us through the rest of the agenda. And our first speaker is Marieke. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing it properly, Marieke, and she's from the International Trade Union Confederation. And as you know, Patricia's just already mentioned the fact that we have been pressing both the UK and Irish governments to ratify the ILO Convention 190 on the elimination of violence and harassment in the world of work. And this is a new international standard which trade unions can use to negotiate effective remedies and workplace policy. So hopefully, Marieke, you're going to give us some further insight to that new convention. So over to yourself, Marieke.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Geraldine. And I also want to say that thanks very much for inviting me for this very important meeting, because it's really, really key and important to make C190 a reality everywhere. And the work you have been building up in Ireland, we have been following it very closely for already a long period of time, covered also some of your actions and activities in our C190 newsletters. So I really would like to congratulate you with the very important work you're doing. I will give you just a global picture first about where we are with the campaign, what we have been building up, and then I will zoom into by region, but particularly on what is happening around C190 in Europe. So let me just start that. The ICTU has a campaign in place, the C190 campaign, but I just want to mention that we have been campaigning for many years, and all of you. This is a we thing. This is like a big global campaign which has been running by unions for many, many years. First, to ensure the adoption of ILO Convention 190 at the ILO conference, and then finally to continue with the campaign to ensure the wide ratification of C190. And so last year, for instance, we celebrated on 25th of June with many of you and across the world that ILO Convention 190 came into force, which was a very critical first stage to take in making C190 a reality for every worker around the world. And as we all know that violence and harassment, and particularly gender-based violence and harassment, they remain one of the most tolerated violations of workers' human rights. And this is unacceptable. It deeply affects workers in all their diversity, no matter which sector. And as already mentioned by Patricia and some of the previous speakers, but the COVID-19 pandemic has showed an enormous surge as well in gender-based violence in the world of work, but also particularly domestic violence. And this happened across the world, all over. And that's a big sign which underpins even more the importance to ratify ILO Convention 190. And it's of course not only about ratification, we want to make it happen in practice. And I think Patricia, you pointed it very well out, how to make sure that this convention is becoming a reality in practice. And that means also a lot of work needs to be done. I can share with you, for instance, that also unions in France have been very have done a lot of advocacy work as well concerning the position of France. France, for instance, wanted to last year made a lot of efforts to ratify C190, but they said our laws and policies are in order, so we don't need to actually adapt anything. And so the unions, and particularly the women in unions, were furious because the current legislation does not make any references or is not adequately in line with the provisions related to domestic violence, the provisions in C190 and the ILO recommendation 206. So I think this is a battle we have also in common across the world as unions, to make sure that governments, even when they say we are willing to ratify, but that they are really serious in making sure that they reform their laws and policies and practices in reality. So, in short, actually, the ILO instruments provide various pathways to make C190 a reality. As I said, we need to make sure it's ratified, and we need to ensure it's effectively implemented, that national legislation pieces are in line with the provisions. But also a lot of unions across the world are now working very hard when they are negotiating collective bargaining agreements to make sure that provisions in the instruments are aligned with collective bargaining agreements and with workplace policies. This is also another way of making these instruments a reality. And I think it's very important to point out that also the instruments are very important tools for awareness raising, for providing information and education, because this is really needed. It's really needed to work on that as well, because for many reasons. So since the since we are running this campaign, we have seen national campaigns of unions across the world in over 60 countries. I actually think it's more. We're going to carry out a monitoring process soon to get the exact figures, but it's at least more than 60 countries. Unions have C190 campaigns, and that's really from across all the regions. And we work very closely with the global union federations. Last year, for instance, we published a toolkit, a training of trainers toolkit around ILO Convention C190, with a lot of examples, with a lot of guidance on how to make this instrument a reality. And I really encourage you to have a look at it. I will post all the relevant links later on in the chat so that you have access directly to the links. And also the ILO is running the C190 ratification campaign, and they managed to get support from tripartite constituencies in quite a good number of countries, where you see quotes from employers, governments, and unions in support of C190. And also, I want to point out that ILO has produced an excellent guide as well, which also provides further guidance for your work at the national level. And again, I will post that link later on. And what also really is, I think, very supportive is that we have, ITUC has been receiving a lot of support from feminist and women's rights organizations or women's rights advocates. For instance, of the 16 days of activism, which is coordinated by the Center for Women in Global Leadership. They have been supporting the ratification campaign for years, and Human Rights Watch is also very upfront in supporting the campaign, as well other civil society organizations, and including UN Women. I don't have a lot of time to elaborate on it, but I can share more information on request if there's a need to. I also would like to, so where are we actually at this stage of the campaign? So far, there are 10 ratifications of ILO Convention 190, and we have done a mapping, and about 20 governments are expected to complete their ratification process this year. So just to give you a snapshot of some of what is happening by region, for instance, in the Americas, the region has from the very beginning had a very dedicated regional campaign in place, and also celebrated one of the first ratifications of ILO Convention 190, like Uruguay, Argentina, Ecuador. Peru just recently finished their national ratification process, and Mexico, that was last week, we got information, they're very close to ratify or complete the national ratification process as well. And this was a big win for the unions, who encountered initially a lot of opposition from the employers. In the Asia and Pacific region, they also have a very dedicated regional campaign in place. Fiji was one of the first to ratify, and strong campaigns we see in Nepal, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and in Pakistan. And in Pakistan, we also very recently received the news that unions are successfully campaigning and resulting now in a kickoff of the ratification process of C190 by the government. So in Africa, also some amazing progress has been made with ratifications by Namibia, Mauritius, and Somalia, and South Africa being one of the latest who completed the ratification process. And also they have been quite supportive, including the government, who has been encouraging actually leaders in the Africa region to ratify C192. And then we come to Europe. And in Europe, I must be honest with you, we have been battling what is happening with this EU decision. It's really, to some extent, it confused me, this EU pending decision to allow EU member states to ratify C190. And what is the reason behind it? Because a couple of years ago, when another convention was adopted, ILO Convention 189 for domestic workers, there was also an EU Council decision allowing actually to EU member states to ratify C189. But the whole intention and idea behind this EU decision was to actually encourage member states to ratify C189, not to delay or to postpone the process. And so this is really something which the ITUC has a particular opinion on this, and actually ETUC and ITUC agree on this, because it's really not necessary to wait for this EU Council decision. And it is expected that the Council, the EU Council legal service is going to come up soon, or will release soon a decision, and that it looks that it's going to be a positive decision. That EU member states can ratify C190. So that's an update on that one. And yeah, and in Europe is getting started too. So finally last year we had first ratifications in Greece and Italy. I mentioned already France is making progress with the national ratification process. But unions together with civil society organizations are strongly campaigning to make sure that it is the national legislation is in line with provisions on domestic violence, which is really key. And Spain is also making progress with their national ratification process. And Albania finished 2 weeks ago their national ratification process. And other countries in Europe who are on track are Germany, Netherlands, Finland, Croatia, just to mention a few. And then, of course, we have the United Kingdom making significant progress too. So in November, the government moved the ILO Convention 190 to both houses and stated that the UK should ratify C190. And also they stated that they have the legal framework in place to ratify C190, including civil and criminal law provisions, as well as occupational health and safety law. But they have plans to further strengthen their law and policies with the requirements for employers to take steps to prevent their employees from experiencing sexual harassment and introducing explicit protections for employees from harassment by third parties. For example, customers or clients. We are not sure yet where the UK is, but yeah, in January we got again positive signals that UK is close to ratification. But as soon as we have more information about that, we will certainly share that with you. So yeah, to close actually my contribution, I just would like to compliment you once more with all the work you have been building up in support of ILO Convention C190. And I really hope that Ireland will be very soon the next to make that happen. We are following it closely. And when there's any assistance or advice needed, we are happy to support you. So, and let me close by saying that the C190 campaign will be here to stay. It does require a long-term approach. And at our first session of the 4th World Women's Conference, which took place last December, we discussed many inputs and priorities, or actually the women in unions across the globe discussed inputs and priorities for the C190 campaign for the next coming years. And that will form the basis for the inputs for the ITUC Congress in November. So we expect that there will be some serious discussions around how and the best ways to move forward with this very important campaign. So let me close by saying, let us stand united until all can enjoy the right to a world of work free from violence and harassment, and in particularly gender-based violence and harassment. So thank you very much.
Marieke, thank you so much indeed for your presentation and the update on the 190 campaign globally. I can assure you, as a Congress and as Women's Committees North and South, we will be continuing campaigning to ensure the full ratification and implementation of the C190 convention. And just to say, I'm not sure whether you're aware of this, Marieke, but we're at the moment being consulted on two new strategies here in Northern Ireland. One is a domestic and sexual violence and abuse strategy, and the other one is a strategy to tackle violence against women and girls. So we will be ensuring that the convention is very much up front and centre within both of those strategies. So thank you very much, Marieke. Okay, turning now to Mandy and Eileen from the Financial Services Union. Patricia has mentioned the sterling work that they have been doing with Danske Bank in relation to the development of a domestic and sexual violence and abuse strategy. So we're going to hear from Mandy and Eileen in terms of their work. Over to yourself, Mandy.
Sorry, I'm muted, am I? Okay, now. Thanks very much for the invitation today, and we're absolutely delighted to be able to share some of the work that we've been doing. I know our colleagues in both the Women's Committee in the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland are aware of what we've been doing for the last few years, but it's good to share it with a wider group, and especially around International Women's Day, so it's really important. I suppose just to maybe start off a little bit about how we got focused and involved in this issue, and it was really the ICTU survey that was done a number of years ago that was the catalyst for starting this work. It was an all-island survey, as a lot of you know, basically surveying people's experiences on domestic violence in the workplace. And we found the results of that survey really harrowing. There was 82% of respondents were female, and that 75% of those abused women were actually targeted in the workplace. So we set about then, you know, making claims to employers around domestic violence workplace policies. And as part of our claim then would have been all of the, I suppose, things that both ICTU and the TUC were saying should be the practical support measures that need to go into policies, these policies to help workers. So that's what we put together. And the timeline then, I suppose, that we had took a really long time to get it done. Danske Bank was the first employer that we put the claim in with. And although they said at the time, you know, you're kicking an open door, they kind of said they didn't have the HR partner resources there available to work through this with us. And then I suppose during that time period of the last couple of years, they did hire, and I have to give a shout out to the wonderful HR partner that they did bring on board, because, you know, without her, I suppose, expertise as well, because she was involved in women's aid, she got really into this, and then it just snowballed, and we managed to get the policy launched last year during lockdown, during COVID-19. So it was a really important time for that. And, you know, there's things in this policy that I suppose differentiated from other policies. There's a lot of work around dispelling myths, you know, multiple definitions of domestic violence. You know, there's a lot of case studies in it as well. It's just a very robust policy that really explains how abuse affects those in the workplace and recognizes what you can and can't do. Now, when I talked about, you know, some of the things that we wanted in the policy ourselves, and that what we're putting forward with other employers now as well, is you need a number of significant practical support measures, which I'll touch on in a second, but also you need to list like all of your support services that are available. You want a commitment of confidentiality, a really good communication plan for publishing the policy, and, you know, for making sure that staff awareness, because you need it to be really embedded into the organization. Information around staff training, really important as well, and also including a process for monitoring and reviewing the policy. And, you know, the policy is out 12 months now, so we'll be looking to do a review shortly as well around that. You need a lot of information and education on the subject matter as well, because, as I said, there are a lot of myths about that, and, you know, that all needs to be dispelled. Access to confidential and independent counselling services paid for by the employer is really important as well, and no negative action taken under sick leave policies for excessive absence, because we know that that I think even in the ICTU survey, it said that there were a number of absences a month that women had due to domestic violence abuse. So we don't want that to snowball into any disciplinary actions. No negative action taken under performance policies either for poor performance, which is really important as well. This policy has a special paid leave, and it has, we say minimum of 10 days, but it says 10 days in the policy. But what the bank have said to us, that is, you know, the policy has 10 days special paid leave in it, but if employees need more time or need more, they will accommodate. So it's kind of really a minimum of 10 days. Paid time off, obviously, for visits to support agencies is really important for solicitors, court hearings, any kind of rehousing needs, childcare issues. And as Patricia alluded to earlier on, oftentimes these are the only times that women can access these meetings, and this time to do this is while they're in work. So it's really, really important to accommodate that. Also, the policy allows for flexible working arrangements. And I suppose this is important because we do know that perpetrators do target their victims in work. So, you know, sometimes on the way to work or sometimes on the way home from work. So changing, you know, locations, work times, if they're in a front-facing public role, allowing them to change those roles is really important as well. And then, of course, diverting phone and email access as well, because we know people can be abused through their phone and email. Salary advance if the employee is escaping a violent situation or suffering any kind of financial abuse. And also ensuring that a victim or survivor never works alone if that's what they request, and having proper security procedures in place for raising the alarm. So having that planning in place should a perpetrator show up at the workplace, because this doesn't just affect the person that is actually being abused, it also affects their colleagues as well. And as Patricia also alluded to earlier on, procedures for dealing with perpetrators in the workplace. This we thought was really important, and it was kind of, you know, in some ways it was a difficult thing to navigate in the policy, because, you know, unions are always, you know, saying what happens outside the workplace, don't bring it into the workplace, don't discipline people. But we felt really strongly that this was something that does have to be dealt with in the workplace, even if it happens outside. And the other part of it as well is that a lot of perpetrators do actually, you know, use their own work email or their own phone to commit that abuse as well. So, you know, if you think about the amount of people that are suffering from domestic abuse, we're working alongside a lot of perpetrators as well. And in big employments, especially like employments like Danske Bank, for example, which this policy alludes to, there are an awful lot of people who are in couple relationships, either married or living together, etc., that actually work together. So it is something that really did need to be included in the policy. One of the things that was really, really important to us is really was around the training and the rollout and the support, because we didn't want this to be just a paper policy. It had to be backed up by proper support systems. And this Danske Bank policy is a really, really good example of that with the rollout. And in fact, Women's Aid, Men's Advisory Project and the Domestic Violence Unit of the PSNI all said that the way that this was rolled out was extremely good. It's a very diverse policy. Those agencies were involved in designing the training. So this policy was socialized over a number of weeks with information briefings, awareness sessions, so everybody got to attend. So it wasn't you're invited to, if you want to attend, everybody had to attend, and it's also included in all inductions as well. And the training itself included the ability to identify if a colleague is experiencing difficulties as a result of domestic violence, which is really important. And it also dealt with how to respond to a disclosure in a sensitive and non-judgmental manner, how you would provide the initial support, how you would be clear on the available workplace support. So making sure that everybody knows what the workplace support is, understands it, and how they can help somebody. And then, of course, the safety planning as well, and being able to signpost to other organisations and sources of support, things such as Men's Aid, Women's Aid, Safe Ireland, Respect, Men's Advisory Project, Nexus, Rainbow Project as well. So all of these organisations, and really understanding that it's not the colleague, your co-worker or your manager that's a counsellor. They're really here to explain the policy to you and understand, you know, support and, you know, signpost really. Another thing around this policy that just show you this what the policy looks like. Another thing around this policy we felt was important because all of this was happening during lockdown and COVID-19. We know that lockdown and confinement has led to unprecedented spikes in domestic violence incidences. So we felt that having something in the policy around that was also going to be really important because of hybrid working going forward and home working, making reporting and seeking help much harder. Something would have to be in the policy around that. We know abusers have a greater chance of exercising control if people are at home more, and it's more difficult for employees to access workplace support. So it was about letting managers know that they must be alert to recognizing the signs with people working from home, and to encourage workers to still seek supports and offer even some online support if that helps. And if there was workers who were already being supported through the policy, to adapt that if there's any kind of home working arrangement, if that meant, seeking ways to find ways to communicate with them covertly, or, all still encouraging the use of the special leave to attend the court or the legal or police or other appointments, and also ensuring that there's always up-to-date information that can be signposted online as well. I suppose we know that research shows that women with a history of domestic violence are more likely to have lower personal incomes due to destructive work history, to change jobs more often, sometimes be more likely to be in precarious work. So keeping a job is really key to the pathway to leaving an abusive or violent relationship. And that's why being in work is often the only time that a person being abused has the freedom and capacity to plan their escape without their abuser's knowledge. And I think it was one thing that the ICTU survey really revealed, like how rarely these people who are experiencing domestic violence actually disclose it in the workplace. So having policies in place and addressing domestic violence and breaking the stigma and showing workers who are experiencing abuse that they're not alone is really, really an important message for employers to give. And I suppose one of the important things about this policy as well is that, and it was communicated again by Women's Aid and the PSNI, is that it's a kind of a policy that doesn't have judgment. The policy allows people to move at their own pace, which is really important if somebody is being abused, not questioning, why don't you leave, or pushing people to leave. It's really about not getting frustrated with the person, allowing them to move at their own pace and being understanding and offering support. So that's very clear in the policy as well. And I suppose just a final thought really, keeping women in employment, as I said, and allowing them to be financially independent really affords a woman an opportunity to escape. And I suppose that's why these policies are so important to have in the workplace. And we really need to strive to get them in all sectors, all employments, and even get them legislated for, that we're very, very welcome of the domestic violence leave bill that's coming on board here in the Republic of Ireland. But we're also very vocal about the fact that unless that's married with domestic violence workplace policies, the take up for leave like that is probably going to be minimal. And through ICTU and through David Joyce, we've had the opportunity in FSU to go and speak to the Department of Justice around this stuff, and also to the Minister's Department around how you would marry these leave policies with the bill, etc. So there's an awful lot of work that needs to be done. I think we're all committed in both women's committees to getting that work done, and hopefully we can push forward and get it done as soon as possible. Thank you.
Mandy, thank you so much indeed for that excellent overview of the key provisions of the policy. You have done sterling work in terms of the development of that policy and the very important provisions contained within it. It really will be a good model for us to adopt within our own areas, absolutely. And I think the important point there that you made in terms of marrying in terms of legislative developments in relation to domestic abuse leave, with the need to develop workplace policies as well, is key. And in the North, we have been engaging with Rachel Woods, who tabled the private members bill on the provision of statutory paid leave for domestic abuse. So we hope within both jurisdictions that statutory paid domestic abuse leave and will come into realisation sooner rather than later. But thank you so much, Mandy. That's a tremendous piece of work that you have been doing within Financial Services Union. Is Eileen Eileen, do you want to add anything before I move on?
She is there. I know she is. Where is she? She's on silent.
If you're happy enough, Mandy, we can move on then. Eileen, there you are.
Yes, sorry. Look, to be honest with you, Mandy has covered a lot of the things, and I know that Taryn has to go at 1:30. I suppose the only thing I would want to say and add is that, you know, we have, as a union, we're taking this very seriously, and that we have tabled the issue of gender-based violence with all our employments, and we're hoping that because we have the Danske policy and is such a robust policy, that we will be able to replicate that throughout all our employments, because I do believe that having a policy in place lets the employee know that there is someone and there's help out there, and that they can ask for it and feel safe in the knowledge that they can ask for it. And Mandy has sort of mentioned it already, but I do believe that it shouldn't be just a policy to be sitting on the shelf or in the web or wherever, or in the cloud as they call it now. I do believe that the policy should be a live, what I would call a living policy. And I know in Danske Bank, that's what we aim to do. And we aim to do it with all our employments. I'm hoping that we will be successful, because there are some employees saying that, yes, we'll do it, but there's a lot of things going on. So look, I'll not keep, because I know Taryn has to go. So thanks very much for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mandy and Eileen, thank you so much indeed. I'm going to invite Taryn Trainor from Unite to give us an update on Regina Colley House. Taryn, I know you have to leave soon, so that's why I'd like to invite you in now rather than at the end of the session. Go ahead, Taryn.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Actually, the meeting that I'm going into, they're just phoning me there because I still haven't received the link, so I'm not going to panic too much. Thank you very much for allowing me to come in and talk about a protest that Unite's involved currently in a hostel, which is in West Belfast. Now, the history behind this hostel was, it's Regina Colley, it's run by the Legion of Mary, who have actually employed a management committee actually to run it. As far as I know, the history behind that was there was one in the north, there was one in the south, and these were put in away before we had Women's Aid. I think it was established in 1935. It's a beautiful building, old building, and it's in a residential area with green railings around the outside of it. And it hosts women who are homeless, who have addiction problems, who have encountered domestic violence and mental health issues. And sometimes they have all four of those. And actually what I didn't realise and never thought, some of these people work as well and go to work while they're living there. So the hostel takes people in from all over Northern Ireland. It's the only hostel of its kind in Northern Ireland. And I know the management committee have been putting around various rumours saying, yes, there are other hostels. No, there are not. There's one down in Ansgate, which provides overnight accommodation for homeless women, maybe for one evening. It's the only single sex hostel. Now, there's single sex hostels for men who are homeless. This is the only one in Northern Ireland that's single sex for women and has 24-hour care. When I say care, it's support from support workers. So one of the residents that I was speaking to, she suffers from PTSD. She would have night tremors. She's on nighttime medication. She likes the assurance of knowing that there's somebody there at night that will maybe sit for her for 2 or 3 hours whenever she's up, and make sure that she gets her medication as well, because sometimes when she's unwell, she forgets to take it. So it's all of that backup. These women are allowed to stay there for 2 years, and then they can move on, but they can come back 2 weeks later and come again. I think they're only supposed to go twice. So there are a lot of phone calls coming from people who were previously there, because they always say you can come back again. And recently now they've had to turn those people away. So what has happened since the start of COVID was that their numbers have been dropped from 23 down to 11 because of the COVID restrictions, and also the staff. Over this period of time, the management committee have started running the place down. They started to get rid of staff in strange ways. People just disappeared, the chef. And they also then had cut the numbers down, where they were supposed to have 2 people on in the evening, which was being the recommendation, the risk assessment, 3 people on during the day. They had people working on their own, and the current way it was just before the staff were told that they were being made redundant. There was 5 part-time staff and 1 volunteer running a centre 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, which, I mean, look at the maths there. So they've been generally, the management committee have been running it down. Then they told the staff before Christmas that they were going to make them redundant. We then became involved 9 weeks ago, and the staff had got a whisper. There were rumours going around that they were actually going to close the centre and get rid of them. So they have consistently been doing a work-in. Our community branch got involved. They've been up every day, sitting outside, showing support. There's been a huge amount of unions up. Belfast Trades Council was up. Quite a few of the unions. I know Denise Walker there has been up quite a few times with the GMB. NUJ are up. Unison have been up. NIPSA have been up, showing support, and our various branches as well have been donating money as well to keep the work in going. So as I say, last week then, on that day, whenever they decided that they were doing the work in, they were actually harassed by one of the management committee who was effing and blinding at the staff, and had grabbed one of the girls by the arm and told her to get the F out of the place. So this was the type of management that you had running a hostel for vulnerable women. And the staff have also told me that the manager in the place very often referred to the women that were resident there as heroin whores. So these are the sort of people that this organisation is funded by the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, and the money originally will come from the Department of Communities, who set up the policies for this for homeless women. So these are the sort of people managing that, happy to run the organisation down, knowing that there's not another organisation to come in the short term. It's very difficult to get hostels established because you have to get the planning permission and get them in a certain, if you're going into another area. So the Northern Ireland Housing Executive are bound to have known, for at least a period of 6 months that this place was closing down, and nobody was making any attempts to ensure that this vital service continued. Be it doesn't need to be with the Legion of Mary, but somebody needs to be providing this. It shouldn't be in the charitable sector anyway, would be our opinion. It should be getting run by the Northern Ireland Housing Executive. So anyway, they had a grievance in about this behaviour and about the way they had tried to proceed with their redundancy talks, and they sacked them last week. We had tried to get the meeting deferred because I actually couldn't attend because I was away, and insisted on the meeting being held last Thursday, sacked them the following day, 2 days before their redundancy was to take place. So these are the sort of characters that you're dealing with. And as I say, the whole hostel would have been closed only for the courage of these women. Now, of these women that work there, the workers knew once they walked out that place would be closed and there wouldn't be another hostel opened. And God knows when anybody would have got round to opening it. There were still 3 residents living there at the time, and the staff weren't going to let those women down. So we've been having, we had a meeting with Deirdre Hardy, the Minister for Communities, last week, and we've asked her to show the same courage that the workers have shown in providing, you know, another hostel. We need something urgently here, and we need these workers, we need their jobs protected too, especially whenever you see how they have gone over and above to try and retain this service and to highlight the need for the service. I know there's another meeting there this morning with the Northern Ireland Housing Executive too, to see what can be done. The staff currently obviously are appealing being sacked. So as I say, that's where we are, and continuously, even at this moment of time, you still have people phoning in, asking for beds, looking for somewhere to go. And as I say, people from all sides of the community in Northern Ireland were using this service. It wasn't just for people in West Belfast. And whenever I did have a meeting with one of the women's organisations in West Belfast, they were able to tell me that there is no refuge in North Belfast for women who are suffering from domestic violence, which is shocking when you think of how densely populated that area is. They depend on Belfast and Lisburn Women's Aid Refuge for anybody that's suffering from domestic violence, never mind all of the other associated problems that these women have that stay in this service. So, it breaks your heart listening to some of the stories. A lot of these women as well are mothers and have children. They've had their children removed for the children's own safety because of parents' addiction problems. Those children are currently being minded in social services or maybe fostered out. But once these women have got an opportunity to get themselves sorted out, they have an opportunity here to get their children back once they would leave Regina Coeli, and they can show that they can live independently for 6 months. And during that course of time, they still have contact with their children. But once they would leave there, they can prove that they're not dependent on any alcohol or drugs. They have an opportunity to get their children back if they lived independently on their own. And that in itself, to me, is worth volumes, that if you can stop a family from being broken up, and there's another opportunity for children to get back with their mother and get back into that family unit, I think all stops should be pulled out, to save that service and make sure that those women have every opportunity to get their lives back on track. So that's where we are with it. So it still goes on, and hopefully, but we'll get that resolved shortly.
Taryn, thank you so much indeed for updating us on what is happening within Regina Coeli Hostel, and I can assure you that we'll do whatever we can to support the women and to support you in your campaign. So we wish you every success in that, and whatever we can do, we'll do that to support you. Okay, folks, I am conscious of time, and we have one final speaker, Maxine Murphy-Higgins from the National Association of Students Union Workers and Teachers. Maxine, over to yourself. I know you're going to give us an update in terms of your presentation around upskirting and downblousing as part of your presentation to the Justice Committee. So over to yourself, Maxine.
Okay, thanks, Geraldine, and thanks everyone for the opportunity just to speak to you today. And I suppose what this case does is show how a piece of casework can turn into essentially a campaign for justice issue that we've been involved in for a number of years. I'll just give you a bit of a brief overview of where we've been over the last number of years. And if you said to me this was going back as late as 2016, I wouldn't have believed it. But in November 2016, two of our members in Enniskillen Royal Grammar School were informed by a police officer that a pupil had taken several covert images under their skirt whilst they were teaching. And these images had been found on a USB device that the pupil had in his possession while he was in school. The pupil was suspended for 17 days. The school didn't believe that it was necessary to expel the pupil. So he was allowed to return under risk assessment, and our members also had individual safety plans, but they were expected to provide work for him during this period of time. The PSNI completed their investigation and submitted a file to the PPS in December 16. In April 2017, the PSNI informed us that the charge had been changed from voyeurism to outrage and public decency. In April 17, the PPS returned a no prosecution decision on the basis that its conduct could not constitute a criminal offence under the law in Northern Ireland. And I think even now and today it hasn't changed. That law has not changed, and that's one of the things we've been campaigning for. In September 17, with the support of the NASUWT, our members sought leave for judicial review. In February 18, so we're a year and a bit on, under the legal proceedings pertaining to the judicial review, the PPS reversed the initial no prosecution decision, concluding that the test for prosecution was met to prosecute the suspect for 3 offences of outraging public decency, contrary to common law in respect of each of the so-called upskirting recordings. Subsequently, this was enhanced to 5 counts. The PPS wanted to dispose of this via a divisionary proposal, but the perpetrator rejected this and pleaded not guilty to 5 counts of outraging public decency. He was not and could not contest the fact that he took the images and videos, but he had not committed a criminal offence of outraging public decency. The case was heard in January 2019, and the judgment was delivered on the 27th of February 2019. The judge and the lay panel found him guilty of each of the 5 complaints against him, and in summary, the panel made the following findings of fact. The acts of the defendant were lewd, obscene, and disgusting. These acts were such to outrage public decency. There was a wide body of potential witnesses to those acts who were capable of being outraged by those acts. This included pupils and teachers of the school, as well as lawful visitors to the school premises. The school was not a private place, despite having a restricted access policy, and there was sufficient evidence that those acts took place in the presence of 2 or more people who were capable of seeing the nature of the act. Pupils, members of staff at the school, and lawful visitors could be considered to be members of the general public. You will note that in all of that judgment, there is no mention of the actual victims and how they felt in relation to this. It was all about how other people could be outraged by their offences. So although this does provide some level of protection for teaching staff and for pupils in schools, it highlighted the inadequacies of the law as it currently stands, as it seeks justice for the public who may have been outraged by the behaviour, but does not grant the victim justice for the invasion of the sexual acts that was committed against their person. It took 18 months battling with the PPS to get them to overturn their original decision not to prosecute, and then a further 12 months to secure conviction. This highlighted significant failings in the law and in the way in which victims of these offences are treated. The legal proceedings centred around not what he did and the devastating impact on the members personally and professionally, but where he did it and who might have witnessed it. He contested the case on these grounds. The PPS were very reluctant to prosecute at all, even when they did decide they wanted to prosecute under outraging public decency. Their hand was forced by the perpetrator, who refused of divisionary disposal. The initial position taken by the PPS and the subsequent fight for justice has further compounded our members' distress, especially in light of the degrading and humiliating content of those images. The current legislation that's going through the Assembly at the moment in relation to upskirting and downblousing deals with the question of whether or not sexual gratification was taken. In this case, the PPS merely took the perpetrator's word for it, because he said in an interview that he didn't take any sexual gratification or share the images. Therefore, under the bill, which as it currently stands, with the current clauses in place, it is likely that he would still slip through the gaps in the law. The perpetrator said, "I didn't gain sexual gratification. How do we prove otherwise?" This case would not have proceeded to the prosecution case if the members involved did not have the support and the backing of the NASUWT, and more importantly, if they didn't have the personal resilience to challenge the law once the PPS had refused to prosecute the case. Not everyone has that luxury of either having that personal resilience or having the support of a union. The law needs to be robust enough to ensure that others do not have to go through long, drawn-out proceedings just to get recognition that a crime has been committed in the first instance. And I'll leave it at that today. Thank you.
Maxine, thank you so much indeed for outlining that case that you have been involved in. I am conscious, folks, that we are running behind over time, sorry, and we won't get an opportunity, unfortunately, to take questions. But as Claire said at the outset, if you do have any questions, do post them in the chat before we complete today's session, and we'll pick them up and come back to you on them later on. But also in terms of any resources, we will get them out to you after the event as well. So all that's left for me to do is really to thank all our excellent speakers today for their contribution. And the work that they're doing is absolutely incredible. So thank you all very much indeed. And just to thank you all for attending today and for your participation at our event, and to wish you all a very happy International Women's Day for tomorrow. And I'm just going to hand over to Margaret to see if she has any final comments. Margaret. Margaret, you're on mute.
People like to see me on mute, I think. Just to say thank you very much for the people behind the scenes that put this together. Thank you very much to the speakers. Thank you, Geraldine, for co-chairing it with me. And thanks to the Women's Committee in Northern Ireland. And I think that there's food for thought for both committees to join together in relation to what Patricia King said and to go forward with the policies. And we'll keep everybody updated on our work through the year on this. So thank you all for giving the time to this webinar. Thank you and goodbye.